Okay, so welcome everybody to the CSAE Conference 2022. This is the session on deforestation and climate change, which will go from 12 to 1:30 GMT. So welcome everybody. The rules are the following. We will start at 12:03 and the session format is the following. Presented for 50 minutes. We have 4 speakers in total, meaning that there will be 60 minutes of uninterrupted presentation, followed by about 20 minutes of Q&A at the very end. If you do have a question, you're more than welcome to please ask that question in the chat. So there's this Q&A function that you can press on. The questions will only be visible to the panelists and myself as the chair of the session. And if your question is selected, we will then call on you to ask a question. We'll unmute you for you, and then you will have time to ask your question during the very end in the Q&A session. This session is being recorded, meaning if you use your microphone, you will be heard on the recording, so that just for everybody to be aware. Now, as mentioned, we will start at 12:03, which is in a couple of seconds. And now I would ask our first speaker, which is Sarah, to please start sharing her screen once I stop my share.
Okay, I will try to make this full screen. Sometimes that causes issues and I'll have to share again, but let's try.
Let's give it a go.
Nope. Let me try it again. Okay, that appears to be working.
That looks great.
Great,
Excellent.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so it's my pleasure to introduce Sarah Walker from the University of New South Wales, who will present on her work overlapping land rights and deforestation in Uganda with 20 years of evidence. Sarah, the floor is yours. You have 15 minutes.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for having me. It's a real honor to be here today to present my joint work, which is truly interdisciplinary. So I'm working with a team of economists and sociologists and remote censors from across several institutions, the University of New South Wales in Australia, where I'm based, Oregon State University, the University of Arizona, Macquarie University in Uganda, and Universidad del Tolmina. So the motivation for this work comes from, I'm having trouble. Oops, okay. There we go. The motivation for this work comes from the observation that, a large portion of the world's land is held in informal tenure structures, often customary structures with overlapping rights to use and decision making. And this can create uncertainty over sustainable resource management. Furthermore, we know that forests are a key resource in the management of climate change, and that deforestation accounts for a fairly decent portion of CO2 emissions. And so given the ubiquity of uncertain land tenure regimes and the urgent need for climate policies, it's important to understand how policies that affect land tenure might have environmental implications. And what we're doing in the context of this paper is trying to understand how the impact of land policy reform in Uganda has affected deforestation across varying types of land tenure structures. So what we do in this paper is we collect fine-scale data covering the entire country from 2000 to 2020, and we look at deforestation. And in particular, we look at how key changes in land policy have impacted deforestation across different tenure systems. And we focused in particular on one type of land tenure structure known as milo tenure, which I'll get into in a minute more details, but it represents a unique form of tenure where tenants and owners have overlapping rights. And we compare this to other types of tenure that are prevalent in Uganda, namely private tenure, which is what you would think of as private property, and customary tenure, which are informal, traditional forms of tenure. We look at various changes in land laws that occurred in 2004, 2010, and 2013. And each of these land laws had slightly different motivations in terms of clarifying the rights of tenants or protecting tenants from eviction or incentivizing titling. And we use a fixed effect framework to test for differences in deforestation trends across years and these various tenure types. We also try to explore some mechanisms by looking at differential trends in land certification patterns across tenure types using World Bank data from the LSMS. So what we find, preview of results, I only have 15 minutes, so I'll get into a few details as we go, but overall what we find is that there's no evidence of an effect of an amendment in 2004, but what we do find is that after a particular amendment in 2010, Milo tenure was associated with more deforestation compared to customary or private tenure. Customary tenure areas have similar deforestation outcomes to areas with more private tenure. So this doesn't suggest that, you know, informal ways of managing land are necessarily bad for forest outcomes in Uganda. What we also find is that after 2017, after a real push for titling, we see a decrease in deforestation on Milo land. And so we relate to several literatures on overlapping land rights, how they can reduce investment incentives. We also speak to a literature looking at the push for formalizing tenure with a focus on privatization, which has had mixed impacts across various different places, some positive, some negative. But what we really lack is evidence on how policy interacts with specific tenure structures over the long run. And that's what we can provide with our analysis. We choose to focus on Uganda for a couple of different reasons. One is that it has a unique variation in tenure types. So there is a lot of customary land tenure in Uganda, but they have also private tenure and this unique form of overlapping rights called Milo tenure. And there have been recent efforts to improve tenure security. Also, Uganda is environmentally important. There have been high rates of deforestation over the past 20 years, and it's a hotspot of biodiversity, a habitat for mountain gorillas and bird species, all of which, you know, whose livelihoods are threatened by ongoing deforestation. So just to give you a quick little history lesson, Uganda is a former British colony. Prior to 1894, customary tenure was the pervasive form of land management, and it came in diverse forms throughout the country. Over the course of colonialism, Uganda fell under the British protectorate, and in 1900 there was an agreement between the British colonial government and the Buganda Kingdom, which you can see corresponds to this gray area on the map, to create various tenure categories. So 3 main categories were created in this 1900 agreement: freehold and leasehold land, which is the owning and leasing of land, which we call private; customary land, which is managed according to the local customs, either by clans or families or other informal ways; and something called Milo land, which is a hybrid of customary and private land. So Milo land was created from land that had been acquired by the British colonial government from the Buganda Kingdom and then subsequently returned to the Buganda Kingdom in 1900. In 1908, there were titles, formal land titles given to nobles of the Buganda Kingdom and other high-ranking affiliates to own this land. And so what Milo owners today are represented by, what constitutes Milo land today are titles that were given in 1908. Milo owners can transfer land freely and they can collect rents from tenants. Milo tenants can either be bona fide, meaning that they've been occupying the land for at least 12 years prior to 1995, the 1995 Constitution, or lawful, meaning that they can provide proof that they have paid rent before 1975, or they have proof of permission from the landowner. So this is what, this is in theory what Milo owners have rights to and Milo tenants have rights to, but in reality, things are much more complicated and blurry. So in a lot of cases, Milo owners are absentee landowners. So they've either inherited land a long time ago and they didn't realize they haven't inherited this land, or they moved abroad, or they don't live where the original Milo land was demarcated. And therefore, there's no actual rental arrangement between the tenant and the owner. So there was recent evidence from the World Bank, I think in 2018, showing that only 26% of tenants on Milo land actually know who their landlord is, and therefore many don't pay rent, or they lack proof of occupancy. So there's a lot of ambiguity. There's overlap, first of all, in who has rights to what, and there's a lot of ambiguity in terms of documentation. So over the course of, after Uganda gained independence in 1962, there were lots of revisions to land policy. So in 1975, Idi Amin ends individual ownership. In 1995, there's a new constitution that returns all the land to citizens and reinstates these classic land tenure categories that had been agreed upon in the 1908 agreement. And in the 21st century, what we're going to focus on, there were several amendments to what is known as the Land Act. So in 2004, they decentralized administration of land to local parishes to a much lower disaggregated level. In 2010, there was an act that prohibited the eviction of tenants from Milo land as long as they had been paying rent, and that they could document that they had been paying rent, which in theory should secure land rights. In 2013, there was then an increased bureaucratic capacity to register land, to write new titles, either certifications of occupancy or certifications of ownership. And so we're going to exploit the timing in these various land amendments to see how they correspond to deforestation. So conceptually, we would think that with clearer property rights, there should be better resource management. In terms of deforestation, this kind of depends on the context. So if you have capital intensive deforestation, tenure security would increase deforestation. But in the case of Uganda, where there's a lower intensity of deforestation, so most people are not clearing huge tracts of land, they're not using tractors, they're doing small scale charcoal burning mainly in terms of how they deforest the land. It's not clear that tenure security can reduce deforestation. So in the case of Uganda, in fact, the amendments may have actually increased insecurity because, for example, in 2010, although the intention was to protect tenants from eviction if they had paid rents, as I previously mentioned, because of a large degree of absentee landlords and other ambiguities, a lot of tenants and owners don't even practice this policy of rents. And so anecdotally, what we've read and heard is that there's actually been an increase in evictions after 2010 because now there was a legal, landlords could come back and say, oh, well, you haven't been paying rent for 20 years. So here is a map of the various types of land tenure in Uganda. And in A, we have Milo land, which is in the darker color. It's predominantly located in the center of the country. And if you remember the map I showed you of the former Buganda kingdom, it's highly correlated with the former boundaries of the kingdom. But you can also see in other parts of the country the real prevalence of customary land. So our empirical approach is that we take a random sample of 1 by 1 hectare grid cells. We overlay a grid across Uganda and we randomly sample 300 of those cells, and we extract deforestation data from the Global Forest Change Project run by Hansen and co-authors. And we look at places that had at least 50%, cells that had at least 50% tree cover in 2000, and then we look at annual deforestation from 2001 to 2019. We look at other robustness, which I definitely won't have time to show you today, at 30% and 10% tree cover. We combine that with land tenure information, which we extract from the 2002 census, which allows us to know the percent of Milo land held in customary Milo or private land at the county level. So here's a map of the forest cover data and forest loss data, the raw data from the Global Forest Change Project. We then overlay our grid and extract the information. Here's what it looks like once we sort of harmonize it a bit, looking at 50% forest cover and total forest loss from 2000 to 2019. So you can see that there is initially was a lot of forest cover on Milo land in areas that correspond to heavily Milo areas. And there also is a lot of deforestation over time in these areas.
You have about 4 minutes left, okay?
Okay, I'll get to the results then. So if we look over time at deforestation trends, again, you can see that relative to other forms of tenure, there's a lot of deforestation on Milo land. You start to see an increase after 2004. We find that that's not statistically significant, but after 2010, you see a real spike. And so let me tell you a little bit about how we estimate that. We regress for a grid cell G in County C year T, we estimate, we regress whether or not there was deforestation in that grid cell on the interaction between the percent of Milo tenure in the county in which the grid cell falls, which we interact with year fixed effects. We also look at the interaction of private tenure and these year fixed effects. We control for grid cell level fixed effects, which account for all sorts of time invariant unobservables at the grid cell level, like geographic covariates that could impact deforestation. We also include year fixed effects. And our reference year are the years right before the 2010 amendment. And so what we find, our main takeaway, is that on Milo land, after this 2010 amendment that tried to actually improve tenure security by saying you can only evict people if they pay rent, in fact, what happened is deforestation increases after this amendment, and it continues to increase on Milo land until around 2017, at which point it starts to fall. And when we look at private land, there's no such trend. So we do several robustness checks, which I won't have time to show you, but what I will try to show you is some mechanisms as I click through these slides very slowly. What we try to understand is what is happening with this decline after 2017. Now, this seems to correspond with recent efforts at land certification. And so we leverage data from the World Bank LSMS to understand how certification may have been changing on Milo land compared to other places. And so we can see for a land parcel of a given household in a given wave of that LSMS survey from 2009 to 2018, whether there was a certificate of occupancy or ownership on this land, and the percent of Milo land in the county where that parcel falls, which we interact with time fixed effects, controlling for household fixed effects, and survey year fixed effects. And indeed, what we find is that there has been an increase in titling over time, and around 2018, it's really starting to pick up. And so we take this as evidence that there was an increase in deforestation after this policy change, but as titling starts to increase and tenure becomes more secure, that corresponds with a decrease in deforestation. We don't find any impact on private land relative to customary land, and this is consistent with evidence supporting the effectiveness of traditional tenure systems, and it might give pause to efforts that are really trying to focus on privatization of land, as opposed to what we have here is just certifying and securing the existing types of tenure. So thank you very much, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That's an excellent presentation and on a really, really interesting topic. Our next speaker, because I'm afraid we need to move on rather quickly, is Thierno Bocar Diop from INRAE. So Tiana, if you could please share your screen, and then the floor is yours for 15 minutes. I will again give you a 5-minute warning at the end. I hope I'm not being dropped again.
Is it good? Yeah, are you seeing the presentation?
Yes, if you can make it full screen, then we're good to go. Excellent. Thank you so much. Thierno, the floor is yours. Thierno will present on forest taxation and its effect on deforestation evidence from Cameroon.
Thanks a lot, Niclas. I'm very happy to be around, and this is a joint research with Leon between at Israel. We were trying to explore the link between forest taxation and deforestation in Cameroon. This research is at the preliminary stage, so we will be happy to welcome any comment or suggestion or even criticism in order to improve the pace. So we will start by a brief context and overview of forest law and jurisdiction in Cameroon. We have to move on to the model and specification and the data used. We will finish by presenting the result and the batteries of robustness tests that we've made, and finish by some policy recommendation depending on the result we found. So the first question that we can ask to ourselves is, why should we be interested in the link between forest taxation and deforestation? So with departure from this very well-known situation between the Dominican Republic at the right and Haiti Republic at the left, where there is a significant difference that is noticeable around national borders. And this difference is in the literature related to strong public policies, so public intervention applied by Dominican Republic that help protect forest management and forest resources, and compared to its neighbor that is Haiti. So from that, we ask ourselves whether the same situation can happen in Central Africa. And why in Central Africa? Because Central Africa has the second largest tropical forest behind Amazon, and with more than 200 million of hectares of forest, and more than 60 million of people depending on these forest resources. But most importantly, countries from Central Africa have started since the beginning of 19th to implement reforms such as laws and jurisdictions in order to protect and to achieve a better management of forest resources. Therefore, we were interested in the link between those measures and the trend of deforestation that might happen after. So the motivation of this study is to evaluate the combination of a locked export ban, of a partial locked export ban in Cameroon, and in a combination with forest taxation on deforestation in Cameroon by comparing Cameroon with its neighbor Gabon. So past studies that deal with forest taxation and deforestation, forest taxation in general, are mainly focused on forest land and fiscal revenue. We have only two studies that deal with the theme that we are interested in. The first one is the scarcity studies that found no significant effect on forest taxation on deforestation and forest management in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The second one also is the study of remaining DAT that found that forest policies, including export tax, have reduced deforestation in Philippines. So the value added that we want to bring in the lecture is, first of all, to the best of our knowledge, this study is the first empirical study on forest taxation and deforestation in Cameroon. And we want also to exploit a natural experiment with the quasi-experimental setting by using geographic regression discontinuity design in order to evaluate the average treatment effect of forest taxation on deforestation. We will start with a quick overview of laws and jurisdiction in Cameroon. We have the forestry law that came into force in 1994 with a lot of measures concerning forest management, forest resources, such as export tax, such as a better management of forest resources, and the ability to also to develop the log industry process. And in 1999, we have Cameroon that implemented a partial log export ban for some wood species and an export surtax on undressed wood for other species. So it is a combination of forest taxation that can reinforce the measures that was taken took in 1994. So the stated objective of this reform was to develop the log processing industry, to implement a better management of forest resources, but also to reduce poverty and of the rural communities that depend on these forest resources. In Gabon, its neighbor, we have the law that came into force in 2001 with the objective to protect the forest ecosystem. But surprisingly, we have a law of 2002 that amended almost all taxes and royalties except the failing taxes and the area taxes. So when we compare Cameroon and Gabon, we have three differences. First, the partial export ban applied by Cameroon. Second is the export tax applied also by Cameroon. And third is the factory admission tax also applied by Cameroon. So the objective is to see if this combination of these three measures have had a significant effect on deforestation from 2002 to 2009. So in terms of methodology, we rely on regression discontinuity in order to evaluate the average treatment effect. Here we will use the geographic regression discontinuity. Our running variable will be the national boundary, the national border between Cameroon and Gabon. So we will compare only observation in pixels that are near to the boundary. Those who are in Cameroon will be our treatment group, and those who are in Gabon will be our control group. The idea behind is that observations that are near to the boundary are more likely to have the same baseline characteristics, and we will run a test about that. And the basic idea, the basic hypothesis as far as regression discontinuity is the random assignment of observation. As we have the national border as our running variable, we have the study of Michel Poulos and Bocar who told us that the national boundary in Africa were settled in the 19th century in European capitals without any background knowledge of African continent or civilization. We're quite sure that there is no problem of assignment, and there is a random assignment well before the setup of the public policies. And also, even after the colonialism, we did not modify boundaries in Africa. And we have also faith that there is no kind of manipulation as we are dealing with geographical units. And we've run a test also concerning the covariate, their smooth evolution, depending on the running variable, depending on the bird. So in terms of specification, we use both non-parametric and parametric specification. As far as the non-parametric, we follow skill entry technique by dividing the national border in 15 points. We estimate the local average treatment effect on each point of the boundary, and after we made the average, we compute the average using the delta method that allow us to see whether the forest taxation have had a significant effect or not on deforestation. And as far as the parametric model, we use also a parametric model elaboration in 2018 with the combination that we want to evaluate the effect, but also a polynomial distance function, which is the distance just between the unit that we want to evaluate, the pixels that are in Cameroon and in Gabon, in either side of the national border, and the national border itself. And after we have a vector of covariate that I will elaborate with. So our running variable is the deforested area that we derive from data from Hansen and al. In the study of Sarah. The running variable is the distance to national boundaries, and as far as covariates are concerned, we choose the slope, the market access time, the precipitation, and the night light data in order to account for infrastructure development in both countries. So now concerning the result, we've found that the forest taxation and the combination of forest taxation and deforestation have actually increased the rate of deforestation and the area deforested in Cameroon when we compare Cameroon to Gabon. This is a quite counterintuitive result, but we have some possible explanation. The first one is the partial aspect of the log export ban. We've seen that the log export ban is only focused on some species, and also the log export ban concerns only undressed wood, which means that there are a lot of producers that try to process the wood and try to export it without being subject to the partial log export ban. But the most striking aspect also is the most species used in Cameroon were not subject to the log export ban.
You have about 4.5 minutes left.
Okay, that will be fast. Perfect. So the second possible explanation also is the lack of efficiency in wood processing, which results in an overuse of wood resources in Cameroon, because the government intends to develop the log processing industry by requiring that every wood should be now processed before exporting it in order to improve the value added. But the truth is there were many enterprises that were not efficient before the measures, and now as there were an increase in demand of processing, those enterprises came into the market and bring also their inefficiency, and so that results in a very overuse of the wood resources, and that might also explain the result that we have. The third aspect is the existence of community forests. The community forests are designed to provide rural communities good resources and to fight against poverty. So by the way, community forests are exempt of forest taxation and every measures that are set up by public policy. And the community forests are handled by local chief and local guides. And the truth is, foreign enterprises are taking profit on these measures by concluding some partnership with local authorities and local chiefs, and then exploit all the wood resources in these community forests, and then evade all the measures, price taxation, and all other measures that are set up by the government. So there is really a huge problem concerning those community forests, which are good per se in the intention, but there is also a lot of overuse and abuse as far as partnerships are concerned. And we also found that there is a lot of corruption in illegal activities that increase the level of overuse and production of wood, even for species that are subject to export tax or that are subject to forest taxation. The corruption and illegal activities tend to reduce significantly the impact of those measures. So generally, we seen that there is a real disincentive character of the taxation system, that is more focused on fiscal revenues than protecting forest management action. So we've run a bucket test, changed the parametric version that we've choose, but also divide the stance span into two periods, for instance, in order to try to see whether the result would change. And the result were always throw this to different specification that we've choose. As a summary of our result, we found a very positive and significant effect of the combination of forest taxation and log export ban on deforestation in Cameroon. And the result was obvious with different specifications that we've tried so far. And the implication is the forest taxation that we are under the impression that the forest taxation is more centered on rent and fiscal revenues than the actual protection and management of forest resources. And it will be better to regulate the processing industry fight also corruption in illegal activities, and include more measures in order to achieve better management of community forests. These papers also suffer from some limits. First of all, we are not able to evaluate the effect from 2000 because in Gabon was quite tricky actually, and that's why we started in 2003. And we were also not able to isolate the partial love export ban effect, taking Gabon as a counterfactual. And it is some limit that we will try to improve in future researches, but also we think that it is interesting to focus on optimal taxation and some other measures that might be good for forest conservation. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Thierno. This is a very, very informative paper with some very counterintuitive results. And I'm looking forward to discussing this more after the session. This is just a brief reminder. If you have questions, please do put them in the Q&A. You cannot see others' questions, but we can see all the questions, so please keep them coming. Our next speaker now is Ashley Pople. So Ashley, if you could please start sharing your screen. And Ashley will present on anticipatory cash transfers and climate disaster response. So now we're moving away from the deforestation side towards more climate change and climate disaster topics in this session. Ashley was formerly at the University of Oxford. Ashley, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. And today I'll be presenting about a form of shock responsive social protection or cash transfers in the humanitarian sector in response to climate disasters. And this is joint work with Stefan Durkin, who's also at the University of Oxford, as well as Ruth Hill and Ben Bronkhorst at the World Bank. So just as a bit of motivation, we know that climate disasters of various forms have had large long-run effects on welfare and development. And typically when these disasters strike, vulnerable households will receive some form of support. In particular, zoning in on the humanitarian sector, in particular that sector has received about 18 billion annually towards humanitarian needs, of which a large proportion, about 30%, has gone towards disasters. But usually this response is ex post. It tends to be very late and politicized, so there is typically a needs assessment after the disaster, then there's fundraising, and then by the time the cash or support assistance gets to those who need it, it's been a couple of months. So as of late, there's been a couple of new policy innovations and pilots to showcase that a new form of delivery could be used to expedite this process, and in particular by using forecast-based triggers and pre-specifying kind of action plans and arranging financing. As soon as a predictable crisis is oncoming, these triggers can activate some financing to release support in anticipation of a climate disaster. But there's a bit of a trade-off here between maximizing timeliness and being able to identify who are the most vulnerable people at that point in time. In this paper, we look at one of these pilots that was implemented and led by the UN. And in particular, we ask to what extent a one-off cash transfer help households manage a climate disaster a priori and prevent scarring. Of course, there's a large body of literature that looks at the effects of cash transfers. These are typically looking at regular flows of cash transfers and how that helps households cope with shocks. In particular, when looking at kind of more shock responsive type cash. There's been very limited evidence on the impact of humanitarian cash transfers. So this is particularly cash transfers in the humanitarian sector, especially one-off type transfers, although initial assessments suggest that this approach is very promising. So we present one of the first large-scale evaluations that attempts to quantify the impact of this one-off cash transfer. Why do we think that the timing of the cash transfer matters? So floods tend to be very large and sudden, but with large effects on markets and private assets. And this is particularly true for very low-income households, which will be the focus of the study. There are several mechanisms or reasons as to why we think a more timely transfer might matter. So it can help widen the choice set that households have to cope in the face of disaster. Typically, there are market distortions after a disaster hits, so it's very costly and almost impossible to access those populations. And finally, climate shocks can be traumatic, and that kind of limits the mental bandwidth and people's ability to make decisions. In particular, we evaluate a particular pilot in a part of a very flood-prone part of Bangladesh. And in 2020, this part of Bangladesh, the Jamuna River, experienced the second highest and second most protracted flooding in 2 decades. The World Food Programme delivered $53 to about 23,000 households along this river. And we exploit the fact that there was some plausibly exogenous variation induced by the administrative constraints in the program rollout. So specifically, there were pre-existing lists that were used to target households, and some households on these lists, despite meeting the vulnerability criteria, did not have access to the right mobile wallet account to be able to access this cash transfer. So there are many different types of mobile money accounts in this region, and for some reason or other, the households that didn't have access to active Bcash accounts in particular could not be included as part of the pilot. There's also some variation in the dates within which households receive cash within the same village, which we exploit to look at timing variation. And we collect data on about 9,000 households 3 months after the cash transfer was received. So as I described briefly, and then I'll highlight the key results. So floods are very predictable in Bangladesh. As you can see here, this is the observed and predicted flood levels. And as soon as the flood levels hit a certain threshold, cash was delivered across 5 days. This is significantly earlier than a traditional response, which tends to be about a month later. And as I described, the households were selected if they were on a pre-existing set of lists in vulnerable geographies that were selected. But because only one mobile cash provider could be used, given the time constraints in setting up this pilot, households had limited time to activate or access these accounts. So it was really dependent on which accounts did households happen to have at that point in time when they were called up to be verified and registered in the program. So that meant some otherwise comparable households were excluded. And there was also some variation in the days in which households received cash. These households, if we look at these treatment, so these are households that received the cash to the control group, which are households that did not receive the cash in advance of the flood peak. There's not much, they're mostly balanced on time and variant characteristics, except for a couple which we can control for and do a bunch of robustness checks in our analysis. And we also use data from a second round of phone surveys conducted 5 months after the cash was sent, as well as satellite data. And I'll explain how that was used later. What are the key results? The key takeaways is that the cash improves welfare. So looking at households receive cash just before the flood peak to those that did not receive any cash, 3 months later, those who receive the cash have higher child food consumption, measured as did child consume 3 or more meals that day. It's about a treatment effect of 4 percentage points. We also see higher adult food consumption. And this is kind of measured through a food consumption score index, as well as higher life satisfaction. We look at a various other outcomes. We see that households that receive the cash, and these are all kind of standardized treatment effects relative to the control group. We can see that households who receive cash had less acid loss. So I guess going to the left now is a good thing as opposed to going right. So those who received cash had less acid loss and had lower costly borrowing. They also had a higher potential earnings index, which means that they were more likely to be able to replant or work 3 months later. We don't see a huge amount in terms of the preemptive actions, which was a very crude measure looking at what types of behaviors did people take in anticipation of the flood. But we do see some movement in some of those sub-indices. Importantly, given that we have so many outcome variables, when we do multiple hypothesis testing correction, our hypotheses can stand up to this correction using these false discovery rates. So why do we think that the cash could work? Well, one potential explanation is that cash was received at a critical juncture that enabled households to make a different set of decisions just before the flood, which then mitigated the impact of the flood 3 months later. So households received cash, within about 7 days of the local flood peak on average. And we see that beneficiaries, although they weren't more likely to take a different set of actions relative to the control group on most activities, there is kind of marginally statistically significant evidence that they are more likely to evacuate household members as well as livestock. And more importantly, households use cash to buy food and water, which is quite typical in the setting. And we see when we asked households to reflect back on whether they had to miss any day without any food at all during the flood peak itself, not just 3 months later, we see a massive increase of about 40% treatment effect relative to the control. So in summary, we think, the cash is mostly being spent on food. And so when treated households went through, were navigating the flood, they were less likely to go a day without eating. Treated households were more likely to evacuate the household members and livestock. And potentially, in addition to or as a result, we can't say exactly, treated households were able to preserve productive assets. So they were less likely to lose their small livestock, such as chickens, as well as other types of assets, which is very consistent with a large body of literature showing that early warning systems can help mitigate asset loss. There's a bit of an open question here of whether it's information or liquidity, and we can't really disentangle between this, but we do think that the liquidity played a massive role, given that households, treated and control households, did not differentially report receiving early warnings ahead of the flooding.
You have about 5 minutes.
Great. Just one more thing I want to show, and then we'll wrap up. So the second question we wanted to ask is whether small changes in timing matters. And we can't really look at this question full on because we don't have the optimal research design set up for it. But because there was some variation in the timing of transfer received relative to the local flood peak, this is a combination of both the fact that the local flood peak varied by geography, as well as the fact that households within the same villages receive cash at different dates. We can look at within the same village, what was the impact of receiving the cash 1 day earlier? And we see that the marginal impact of receiving the cash 1 day earlier results in slightly higher food consumption every day earlier that the cash is received. And weirdly enough, also higher costly borrowing, which could also relate to the fact that there was the second Eid right when the cash was being delivered. And so there's really high liquidity needs. If we just do a kind of non-parametric analysis, we see that similar trends, that if you receive the cash earlier, your outcomes are better for all of these indices. I should say, if we do just look at the variation in flood timing within kind of union level, which is an administrative level up, we also see similar effects on food consumption. We see that some of these effects, especially on adult food consumption, persists 5 months later using the second data set that we collected on a subsample of panels. But we don't see anything in terms of the child food consumption, partly because it recovers in the control group. I won't go through this, but just to say our results are fairly pretty robust to controlling for mobile money uses, as well as other forms of fixed effects and winds rising, etc. So just to conclude, we present evidence on the impact of this one-off humanitarian cash transfer that's been delivered in advance of a flood. It's just a couple of days before. And despite being a pretty small amount, about $50, we see that the cash transfer improves welfare even 3 months later. And the kind of notable result here is that children in particular have a 3 percentage point increase in food consumption, which has massive implications for long-term scarring in terms of early childhood development and later education and earnings outcomes. And lastly, we have kind of suggestive evidence to suggest that speed of delivery matters. So receiving cash 1 day earlier has had stronger effects on food consumption, even 3 months later. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ashley. A very interesting intervention in Bangladesh, especially about the predictability of the entire flood. Now, moving on, we have Bruno Conte next, Bruno will present on climate change and migration for the case of Africa. We can see your slides. It's all full screen. Bruno, the floor is yours. It's a pleasure to have you.
Oh, thanks. Can you hear me, right? Okay, so thanks for having me in the program. As Niclas said, I'm going to be speaking about climate migration in Africa today. And the motivation for studying this topic is, in general, the high attention put by academic and policy circles on the possible consequences in climate change, particularly in countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And the main reason for this particular concern in this region is driven by mostly two reasons. That first, most of these countries are low-income rural economies that are highly dependent on subsistence agriculture, then economically vulnerable to changes in the weather. But on top of that, these countries are expected to experience a very large population increase in the coming decades. And therefore, understanding where this growing population could be geographically relocated in a future where agriculture might not be as productive as nowadays has been at the center of the policy research agenda. Indeed, the potential migration flows caused by climate change in the region in the future have been recently coined by these policy outlets as the Great Climate Migration. And some of the most recent of these policy studies do highlight concerning the case of sub-Saharan Africa could be. Some of the most recent of these studies that focus only on a small selection of countries and thinking on internal migration only already highlight or suggest that climate migration in the region could exceed hundreds of millions of individuals. In this paper, what I do is that I dig deeper and more carefully into this issue, and I do so by answering the two following research questions. First, I understand how and quantify by how much can climate change as a shock to agriculture lead to migration in sub-Saharan Africa. And we're going to have a national framework in my setup. So we're going to have both migration within and across countries. And second, I'm going to emphasize the importance of the economic mechanisms behind this climate shock migration relationship. And these mechanisms are going to be endogenous production choice and access to trade. To this end, in my project, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to take a general equilibrium approach and thinking of migration as one of the key mechanisms of the long-run adjustment of the economy to the climate shock. And in particular, this shock is going to be modeled, is going to be allowed to be heterogeneous. There's going to be an agricultural shock to agricultural productivity that is going to be heterogeneous across space, like different locations being differently affected by climate change. But importantly, it is also going to be heterogeneous across crops. And this is going to capture the idea that changes in the weather could alter crop yields differently for different crops, like some crop being more, say, resilient than others. I'm going to learn how this is expected to be so in reality in the future from data by climatologists and agronomists from FIU. And I'm going to insert this concept of climate shock as a agricultural productivity shock, which is heterogeneous across space and crops, into a multi-sector quantitative spatial model that I developed. My model, very intuitively, is capable of explaining how the geography of the economy, like the geographical distribution of the economic activity, its underlying population, all of these distributions could be reshuffled as a consequence of a climate shock of this sort. And therefore, by using this FAO data inside my model, I learned how the spatial distribution of population in Africa would look like in a future in 2080, by the end of this century, in a context within a scenario with climate change. Therefore, by pairing this with the result of another simulation of my model in which climate change does not take place, I identify locations that would have more or less population as a consequence of that. So that's how I pin down where climate migration could take place and how large these climate flows could be. In terms of results, what I find is that indeed climate migration in Africa could be substantial and on aggregate equivalent to about 12% of sub-Saharan Africa's population by the end of this century, which will be more or on the order of about 300 million individuals. And I also find sizable economic losses associated to it. Importantly, we are going to be working on a spatial frameworks, and therefore these results are going to be very heterogeneous across the space. In my empirical setup, the unit of observation is going to be subnational grid cells, like geographical squares. And I find that the bottom and the top deciles of the grid cell level population changes caused by climate change that are going to be of about -30 and 3% respectively, which illustrates how wide is the range of this climate migration effect that I estimate. And if aggregated up, these results are also very heterogeneous across countries. Some countries experience a lot of out migration and some receiving a lot of in migration, immigrants. Another important set of results relate to the heterogeneity of this climate migration with respect to the main mechanisms present in my model. In my theoretical setup, we're going to have producers deciding how much to produce and trade of different agricultural crops and a non-agricultural good. And we're going to find that amongst the most severely hit locations by climate change, those in which the producers are able to adapt their production choices across sectors experience lower population outflows, which suggests that this capacity of adjusting production across sectors works as a sort of mitigating mechanisms. And that would hold in terms of adjustments within the agricultural sector. So in contexts in which a farmer simply switched its main crop of production towards another crop that still produces goods in agricultural sector, or instead in another situation in which factors move out of agriculture locally to a non-agricultural sector, namely in a situation in which urbanization, quote unquote, takes place. Both of these adaptation mechanisms are found quantitatively to mitigate the effects of climate change with respect to population outflows in the most severely hit locations, as well as trade, which is another channel present in my model. And this is very analogous. So in the locations that are, say, better connected to markets through transportation networks, those also experience lower population outflows, conditional on being hit by climate change. In a nutshell, these are my main results. And with them, my paper provides 3 key policy lessons. First, I'm able to tell policymakers where climate migration could take place and explicitly speak about fine-grained geographical units across Africa and tell which of those could be subject to higher or lower climate migration pressures. And I'm able to do that by inserting the richness of Sub-Saharan Africa's geography within a quantitative spatial model that I'm going to illustrate later on how that is done. Second, I document a very uneven pattern of structural change that could take place in Africa in the coming years as a consequence of climate change. As we will see briefly, the climate shock is not expected to be a sort of homogeneous shock across space in terms of productivity Africa throughout Africa. We're going to have a sort of losers and winners. And therefore, we're going to see that the most severely hit locations or countries are going through an important or an intense process of structural transformation, like factors moving out of agriculture to a non-agricultural sector. But we are also going to have locations relatively less damaged, if not benefited by climate change in terms of agricultural productivity. And those are going to intensify or specialize even more into the agricultural sector. So to be able to produce and ship agricultural goods locally and to the rest of the continent. So we're going to have a sort of emergence of a new agricultural hub in Africa as a consequence of the switch of comparative advantages in agriculture across locations caused by climate change. Finally, my structural framework, my model is flexible enough for conducting policy relevant experiments. And I conduct one related to technology adoption in agriculture, and I show that it will could considerably reverse the economic losses associated with climate change. This is my paper in a nutshell. For the time of today, I'm obviously not going to be able to cover everything. So what I'm going to speak today is just to explain very briefly how my framework is built, what's the data used, and how it highlights how we're going to be thinking of climate change in my framework, and then give a glimpse on how my results relate to this uneven pattern of structural change in Africa caused by climate change. Very good. So in terms of data, in my empirical framework, we are going to have divide Africa in subnational grid cells, like geographical squares of 100 by 100 kilometers. And we're going to have the set of cells covering Africa to count of about 2,000 of these cells. And for each of those, I'm going to collect data on GDP for several time periods, population also for several time periods, all obtained from different data sources, as well as I'm going to build a transportation network connecting each of these grid cell pairs using information, the transportation, the road network connecting all of these grid cells within and across countries over the entire Africa. I'm also going to obtain data on the suitability for growing different crops in each of these cells. And this is I'm going to obtain from the FAO GAIS database. And I'm going to collect precisely what is called a potential yields, which is a sort of hypothetical suitability to grow one specific crop in one grid cell based on weather characteristics on these cells. And as these characteristics, the weather is going to change over time, this is going to provide me a measure of how this comparative advantage to grow a specific crop across locations in Africa is going to change over time as the climate changes. This is precisely the element that allows me to introduce climate change in my model. And this slide is precisely illustrating this.
You have about 4 minutes, 4.5.
Sure, thanks. So this shows the suitability for growing one crop of my framework, cassava, in the baseline year in the year of 2000, and then in the future the estimates for 2080. And then what we see is that some locations such as Congo DRC were initially suitable for growing cassava and expected not to be so anymore. And therefore, what my model is going to be capturing is that whether these locations here are going to switch production towards another crop or to the non-agricultural sector, or instead, if the people that live there is going to move somewhere else. This is kind of the mechanism that my model is going to capture, and how it works very intuitively. It is very standard or an extension of very standard quantitative spatial models, in which we're going to have agents with buffer varieties that will create dispersion forces. There are going to be trade frictions that determine comparative advantage in production. There are going to be frictions to mobility of agents that is going to create congestion forces. And all of that is going to provide intuitively spatial equilibrium of the economy, in which each location is going to produce the good that they are more productive at. I'm going to calibrate my model to the year of 2000, and then I'm going to perform simulations for the future by replacing my calibrated though by inserting in this model the population for Africa in the year of 2080, and then I'm going to perform two simulations. One in which I assume that climate change takes place. So for all crops in my sample, I'm going to use that map of cassava in 2080, but for all of the other crops as well. And another simulation in which climate change does not take place. So all of the suitabilities agriculture for the year of 2000. I'm going to obtain two different distributions of population that I can compare and see which locations could be subject to more or less climate migration frictions. And this is illustrated in this map here, in which blue colors stand for locations that are expected to receive the highest in-bulk of immigrants, and red colors the location that is going to expect the largest outflows of people. And we will see that the locations that are mostly located on the eastern side of Africa are precisely those that are expected to receive the largest in-bulk of immigrants. Precisely because these locations, these countries are those that are going to be relatively less affected by climate change. And these are going to specialize very much in agricultural production relative to the scenario without climate change, and this will attract a lot of people to this location. This is precisely seen in these other maps that shows the degree of sector specialization across agriculture and non-agriculture, and red colors stand for the locations that specialize more in agriculture. And we say precisely these patterns in all of these eastern countries of Africa, but what my framework is also rich enough to provide us, it's also the results within countries. And even for these countries that specialize more in agriculture, on average, on aggregate, experience very uneven patterns of specialization across these two sectors within countries. We see Tanzania that some locations do more agriculture, but some others less, so on and so forth for all of these countries. In a nutshell, these are my main results. There are some aggregates on this table that I'm going to skip, and other things that I do in terms of in the paper is that I check like the heterogeneity of my results along these channels in the model that I explained in the beginning. I do a policy experiment related to technology adoption in agriculture. It reduces a lot of the losses caused by climate change. It helps the economy to adapt to the climate shock. And I also do a bunch of robustness exercises. And one set of those that is important to highlight is that I check for the robustness to the uncertainty with respect to how this suitability is going to be in the future, using the data obtained from different climatic models, and also assuming a less pessimistic scenario for the future. If I switch the scenario that we expect for the future for a one in which we can say going to have less pessimistic results. We have all of these results reduced in terms of magnitude. So let me conclude to stick good with time. In this paper, what I do is that I explain how climate change can reshuffle Sub-Saharan Africa's population by 2080 with a very simple yet transparent and tractable quantitative framework that connects these two elements to one another to find that indeed climate migration flows could be substantial and sectoral adaptation and or trade could be relevant channels that mitigate this effect. So with that, I thank you very much for your attention. I conclude my talk.
Thank you very much, Bruno. Excellent presentation, perfectly on time. Thank you very much. And now is the time to open up the floor for questions. And so if you do have any further questions, please do put them into the Q&A box. If not, I would just start with John Walker. They had a question for Sarah Walker. So John, if you are still around, would you mind please asking your question live? I think it's more of a comment and a question, but I think we have time for that.
Yeah, mostly a comment. It's a super cool paper, Sarah, and I just wanted to point out that I think there's a fair bit of theoretical work which has happened in the space of understanding mechanisms which you're describing. They're very much sort of siloed to the Indonesia case and understanding how the dynamics of political economy have implications for implementing policy related to title rights. But I think they might help you to unpack further sort of the discussion of how you could turn the impacts of your paper into sort of meaningful policy contributions. There's also a really cool paper from 2017 by Bart Hartstad in Oslo on sort of understanding the theory of why having weak property rights would have huge implications for choices about deforestation. And maybe having a think about that model might give a little bit more grounding to a discussion of the mechanisms in the paper. But again, a really cool paper and really exciting stuff.
Yeah, thanks a lot, John. And no relation, just a nice coincidence there in our surnames. But yeah, thanks for those suggestions. At the moment, I sort of glossed over it, but the theoretical intuition we're leaning on comes from a paper by Farzan in the JPE from 1984. So it's a very old paper, but it's essentially about how the discount rate impacts incentives for resource extraction, and it depends on how extraction occurs, whether it's capital intensive or not capital intensive. And I think in the case of Indonesia, it's very much capital intensive. The palm oil industry is driving a lot of the deforestation there. But yeah, thank you for those recommendations, and I will check them out and see if we can further develop our motivation there.
Okay, excellent. And then I think Bruno has raised his hand. So obviously the speakers are also more than welcome to ask questions. Bruno has a question for Sarah too. So Bruno, over to you.
Oh, yes, thanks, Niclas. So, Sarah, it's a bit related to what John just asked you about. I was thinking more about like the mechanism driving this title institutional scheme and the deforestation, right? Deforestation could take place for several, say, causes. One is like urban expansion. The other one is, I don't know, land for agriculture. Other one is charcoal, right? Fuel wood extraction. Which one that you have in mind, and what is precisely the relation between like the title scheme and what would cause the other outcome?
Yeah, I mean, so our understanding is that the majority of the deforestation in Uganda is being driven by fuel wood extraction. So it's small scale cutting for charcoal burning. And so there's not very much that seems to be occurring in terms of agricultural conversion, or urbanization. So one of the robustness checks we do that I didn't have time to show is that, we control for lagged indexes of the nighttime lights to get at economic development. That doesn't affect our results. We also interact soil suitability or crop production suitability, which you use in your paper as well. We interact that with time fixed effects, and that doesn't perturb our results at all. And so really what we're thinking...
I was asking you, sorry for interrupting, just because, and precisely that's the reason for possibly relating to John's question, because I was really more thinking about properly like the mechanism, right? Why locations with this specific institutional setup in terms of property rights, people would extract more land for fuel or not, right? Is that forbidden? And then in these locations with this specific institutional setup, people can do that without being caught, you know, like what is really like you see my point?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think what our argument is that you have these overlapping claims to the land. And so in the theory that we're thinking of, which is the discount rate, this incentivizes present bias behavior. And so you can think of charcoal production like a cash crop, but it's just the tree rather than converting the land to
a sort of oil reserve that people just decide to extract all oil in present instead of smooth it through the future. That's the idea.
Exactly.
I see.
Yeah.
Now I see. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, no worries.
Okay, then let me execute my chair's privilege and also ask Sarah a question. So Sarah, I thought this was a very fascinating setting with so many different policy reforms, but I was wondering if you could somehow exploit the timing of these in a way that I presume that the rollout of each of these policies would have taken some time, namely that it is a centrally decided reform, but then it would peter out to the regions that we kind of rolled out over time. To what extent have you even looked at this already? Is there room for exploiting these spatial differences? And if they come in such short waves, it sounds like there could be interesting treatment combinations here available, where the one region just got this one reform pretty late, but then there's another one and that comes quite early, and then suddenly you have all sorts of treatment matrices going on.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And, admittedly, one of the drawbacks to our empirical setup. So all of these reforms happen at the national level. So a law is introduced, an amendment is made to the Land Act, and then local governments are expected to follow suit. We don't have a lot of data at the local level about the extent to which these are actually implemented. The part of the motivation for the mechanism exercise looking at the titling is that is one of the ways we can observe how the last policy is being implemented. So the last policy really tried to build up bureaucratic support for administering these titles. I know, for example, the World Bank is doing a lot of work also on helping local communities issue these titles. So if at some point we can get even more disaggregated data, we could exploit that. But at the moment, we're really just exploiting the time variation in what was announced at the national level.
Okay, thanks. Very helpful. Unless there's any other questions from the speakers or the audience for Sarah, I would then move towards questions for Thierno. So Thierno, thank you very much for the presentation. I think I had just a very high level question to start off the discussion here, which was, have you looked into if this stark kind of border effect, does that exist like across the world? Is it like could you almost do like a macro level investigation of how different countries, to what extent they engage in deforestation? So is that a widespread phenomenon? That's kind of the first question. And the second one, directly related to that, is what is driving that? Actually, I know that you're pushing one story here, which is that there's a policy change on the Cameroonian side, but what is actually kind of really affecting these stark differences across national borders, irrespective of a specific one policy that was rolled out?
Thanks a lot, Niclas, for very tough questions, actually. As far as the wide projection of these studies concerned, I believe that we might be. I think that it might be interesting in a sense that probably we'll find some heterogeneous aspect depending on policies adopted, depending on the context, because I believe that context is everything actually, and somehow it is very true for the studies that we are interested in Cameroon and Gabon. I did not think about that in the first place. So the proper mechanism to do so will be is unknown for me at the present time. Let's formulate it in that way. And I'm sorry, would you mind repeating the second question? I've lost it.
Yeah, the second question was mostly about what could possibly explain these, let's call them the level differences in deforestation. Because I mean, one way to interpret your paper is that the policy may have done nothing. I mean, I'm not saying that this is the, you know, I have absolutely no proof for that, but one interpretation could be that your paper is studying a reform, and the reform has done absolutely nothing on deforestation, but there's an interesting level change in terms of deforestation, how much is being done on each side of the border, and then the question is suddenly, but what could explain that? Especially if that exists across many different borders around the world.
If we focus on some aspect of deforestation in Central Africa, there is different level in different measures applied to protect forest resources, such as Democratic Republic and Congo and Gabon and Cameroon as well. One thing that might explain the differences in terms of deforestation when you compare Cameroon and Gabon is also the existence of some other natural resources like petrol. And we know that Gabon is very good producers of petrol. So communities and people rely more on those resources than resources extracted from forests compared to Cameroon, for instance. Some other resources, some other justification might be, but the quality of institution. But I do not believe that there is a lot of differences when it comes to quality of institution between Cameroon and Gabon. We've known for well that Cameroon there is a lot of corruption and illegal activities, and which is not documented in Gabon, but which might exist at the bottom. So we are not sure about that. And maybe also the development of.
Do you mind interrupting you? It's just because I had a question that goes actually, if not like possibly enriching precisely in this debate. Would you mind? It was just because one thing I was really thinking of that my question was going to be, do you control, like, for instance, time varying exchange rate across countries and commodity prices of logwood across these countries? Because if, for instance, these two countries have different currencies, and just because of the timing of the policy is such that it's confounding with some changes in the exchange rates, this could create just change the value of the logwood in one country and not the other, you know? So like controlling for external demand, because a lot of wood is really just exported, it could be one of the reasons explaining this in the absence of any policy effect on that. Do you see my point?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that I see the point. Actually, they have the same currency. They are in the same. So basically, this is the same exchange rate actually.
It's pegged with the euro, right? With the French currency or something like that.
Yeah, the French CFA related to the French currency exactly. So I don't think that it might. The exchange rate might be relevant in this case, as they are the same type of currency and the same exchange rate actually in evolution in this aspect. Maybe also perhaps you're right, but I'm not very familiar with this aspect as far as Cameroon and Gabon are concerned.
Okay, thank you very much, both for the question and the answer. Do we have any other questions for Thierno? Okay, then in the interest of time, let's also, because I'm aware that in exactly 10 minutes the meeting will close, so we need to move on. Any questions for Ashley, please? I will just kick off with a comment that I may have mentioned before, which is what is surprising here is the predictability of it. So to what extent are people acting rationally that they know it's coming and still they're not getting themselves out of danger? Could you maybe just briefly comment on that? I mean, this has a flavor of the Monga paper by Mushfiq Mubarak and Garrett Bryan and Chaudhuri, right, where you know it's coming and still you cannot avoid the danger. To what extent do households here know that the flood is coming, or is it really hard for them to understand that?
Should I answer, or should I get Bruno to come in first?
If you want, just go first, maybe.
Cool. Yeah, no, it's a great question. So I think it's important to first note that this pilot was set up predominantly as a response to an extreme event. So it's supposed to be 1 in 5 year kind of flood event. So of course, these households are subject to monsoon flooding every year, and they have coping strategies kind of set up in place to respond to that type of flooding. I think what makes this particular flooding event unique is just the fact that it was so high. I mean, just the height of the water levels rising, which then obviously impacts like how far can you go in terms of finding access to higher land, and also the timing of it. So I think it was exceptionally early and also very protracted. So for, instead of being flooded for a few days, we're talking a few weeks, if not months. And that significantly impacts your ability to respond. So I think that the answer will be, I'm sure households were expecting it to come. Perhaps they didn't know when precisely and to what extent. And so I guess our point is that this kind of exceeds their typical coping strategies that they would adopt. But yeah, I think there's a lot of work. The government's currently doing a lot of work to build out early warning systems to be able to communicate exactly these types of messages, given how impactful they are potentially seen to be in other contexts. The evidence is still quite limited.
Okay, so that means it is a lot more like the manga paper, actually, where it's also a protracted kind of long kind of shock to which the only solution may be partial seasonal migration, right? Is that correct?
Exactly. So I guess migration, I'm sure a lot of these households will migrate and then, or even like migrate not very far, and then we'll come back. But it was quite striking how many, so I think there was about 70% of households who left, and it was just quite striking how many of them were still away. I think it might have been, I can't remember if that 70% was how many were still away 3 months later, not able to go back to their fields.
Okay, thank you. So John Walker, they have another question. So John, if you want to ask that live now, and then Bruno has a question afterwards for Ashley too. John?
Yeah, it was honestly mostly answered by the previous response. But the question is essentially, you've argued that cash transfers in this setting are a great safety net for people, and particularly in response to climate change that benefited households. Do you have a sense of whether they could also play a role in localized adaptation measures? So households engaging in sort of protection behaviors for their household, and whether their choice to opt into adaptation measures or into consumption smoothing might be a function of the early warning that you were providing through your transfer?
Good questions. So yeah, I guess the cash probably did serve to communicate some information about the severity of the upcoming flood, undoubtedly. We can't exactly disentangle between the liquidity and the information precisely. I think by receiving the information, I'm sure they would have been able to draw on a large number of different coping strategies, and I think food consumption smoothing was potentially a massive one. Relocating to higher land, I mean, that's something they typically do. And if you have the information, you can do, I guess, depending on whether the flood has already hit and whether you actually need to hire a boat at that point to be able to carry your livestock is perhaps where the liquidity piece comes in. So yeah, I think that's definitely important. And I suppose the piece where we think we are, I think we would like to frame our paper in terms of strengthening existing kind of coping strategies that households have. Just because you don't see huge differences in terms of these like crude behavioral measures that we had just before the flood impact. But given that they spent so much money on food and were able to protect kind of their smaller productive assets, so specifically like chickens, and we see one of the big drivers of the adult food consumption is protein, which is typically in the form of eggs. So I think the idea here is by being able to strengthen their existing kind of strategies they could then minimize how much they had to dip into kind of negative coping strategies, whether it's using up livestock, etc. or even getting them out of harm's way. But yeah, future, I guess disentangling the stuff is something that would be really interesting in future studies for sure. Bruno, do you want to come in? Thank you, John.
Sorry, my question was precisely related to possibly disentangling this liquidity from information channel. Was wondering whether you thought of doing like any sort of heterogeneity exercise, like, I don't know, interaction terms along the asset level dimension to really show that those that are really on the bottom of the asset distribution, those that really are liquidity constrained, are those that are more benefited from being treated. Do you see my point? Because I was really fascinated by results. I thought it was a super interesting project.
I would love to do that. Sadly, we don't have baseline data, so it's just. But
don't you have like a sort of asset loss index or something like this?
We do. We don't. So I guess the problem is that that's measured at n line. So you know, it's like a difference of the assets that you have, and so we don't know what your initial stock was. I fully agree. I think that would be fascinating. The problem is it's hard in a humanitarian setting to know exactly where a disaster will strike, and trying to get stuff out in a few days just before a disaster means baseline data collection is a bit tricky. But I think something that's really interesting, and actually potentially looking into rolling out a study that kind of disentangles this early warning dimension from liquidities. But yeah, no, I think great idea. Thank you.
Okay, then any questions for Bruno, please either put them in the Q&A or in the chat, or if you may want to raise your hand as one of the speakers. In the meantime, let me just ask the opening question here. Maybe we have time for 2 or 3, I hope. The first one is, in the spatial GE kind of solution, it usually doesn't make a difference if we solve for the late equilibrium and then move backwards, or if we solve for the early equilibrium and then move forwards. But in your case, it may actually make a difference, unless I'm missing something here, where the population projections for 2080, I mean, I'm not entirely sure how that black box came about, but what if they were just rolling forward the production structure that these economies were in right as of today, meaning that you have like a built-in bias, so that actually solving for the 2080 equilibrium and moving backwards is giving you fundamentally different results. Am I missing something here, or is there any other reason for why you're doing that?
No, actually, you're not. This is a good question. You're not missing anything, in the sense that because I'm solving a statical GE framework, and first thing is, second, that in my framework, with agents do not make bilateral decisions. It's not that they are born somewhere and they decide where to live. It's almost like people, there's an entire endowment of population that fall from the sky and decide where to live. That does not matter. In Indexation, I'm working right now. I'm really having bilateral choices, country borders, and many things. And then this will matter. And this sort of endogenous fertility rate to the scenario, I'm assuming in terms of current climate change, this will matter. This is coming on the next revision of the paper.
Excellent. Okay. Any other questions? Then the final question for Bruno would be, from my end, what if, as other papers have shown, climate change is not only an agricultural shock, but actually a shock to transportation infrastructure, or even a shock that is affecting productivities in other sectors of the economy, or even if we're taking Ashley's work here as a reference point, if like these floodings are affecting everybody, how are you dealing with that?
I'm doing extensions on that robustness, allowing for shock on the climate change on amenities, like how nice or less nice is a place to live, affecting also the non-agricultural sector. But these are all extensions, because I'm really leveraging the richness of the FAO data that it's on agriculture. So the main thing is there, and then with the others, I leverage other papers, including projects of my own, to explain these other things on extensions. But this is a good, of course, and relevant point as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Bruno. And again, thanks to all the speakers, to Sarah, Thierno, Ashley, and Bruno for the interesting presentations, all the questions and answers. Thanks to the audience for attending. And we can hereby now officially close this session. I hope to see you in the other sessions on topics related, such as electrification later today, infrastructure tomorrow, etc. Have a great day, everybody.